From Software has done it again. Last week, Elden Ring's DLC, Shadow of the Erdtree released, and calling it difficult would be an understatement. As a casual Souls player, I've never done any sort of challenge run outside of accidentally beating the Abyss Watchers with a +0 straight sword. So, I thought it would be fun to challenge myself to beat FromSoft's hardest release while making it even harder. So, can you beat Shadow of the Erdtree using only bows? Let's find out. First, let's establish some rules. I can only use bows, obviously. I will try to use as many items from the DLC as possible, and I have to beat all 10 Remembrance bosses plus Bayle. This run will be done on New Game Plus and +20 Scadutree fragments, but I don't think people will complain once they see the enemy scaling. Before starting the run, I want to remind you that this is my first video, so if there's anything you think that I could improve on or change to make my future videos more entertaining, please let me know in the comments. Now back to the video. To start the run, I immediately ran for Bayle to grab our main weapon of the run, the bone bow. The Rancor Shot skill on this bow is where it gets interesting, as it basically just gives the bow aimbot. You can still miss, but the skill gives your arrows very aggressive tracking. The second thing on our to-do list is to get some armor. Luckily, you have access to a really good set the moment you enter the DLC. You get it after defeating the Blackgaol Knight, so it's not too hard. Oh no. NPC enemies actively try to dodge projectiles. Their dodge is quite literally bound to your attack button, but it's just one fight. Surely this won't be a problem at any other point in the run. I also realized I'd completely forgotten to upgrade my bow, so I went to the Round Table Hold to buy some smithing stones and upgrade it. From here on out, just assume any weapon that I'm using is max upgraded, since the DLC is scaled for late game. We head back to the Blackgaol Knight with our +25 bow in hand, and while he still does give me some trouble, the damage difference from +0 to +25 is enough to get the win. Blackgaol Knight goes down in 3 tries, and with that, we have our prize, the Solitude set. This will be our armor of choice for almost the entire run. Before our next boss, I headed to Caelid to buy some Serpent Arrows, as these do more poison buildup than the craftable version. I knew that status effects would be the way to go for this run since my bow was doing such low physical damage. Our next boss and first Remembrance boss is going to be the Divine Beast. This boss gave me so much trouble on my first playthrough, so I was pretty worried going into this. My first attempt went far better than expected. My strat was to use poison arrows until it procced, and then switch to fire arrows. I hadn't fought him since the DLC's release, so I was a little rusty, but getting him below half health on the first attempt had me feeling pretty confident. Going into the second attempt, I seemingly forgot that the skill on this weapon existed, but my strat remained the same. I poisoned him, and then pelted him with fire arrows. When the poison ran out, I just reapplied and continued my strategy. Surprisingly, this was an incredibly easy and straightforward fight. 2 tries and on to the next. At the end of this fight, I realized I had also forgot to respec out of the build I was using previously, so I headed back to Rellana and went for a Dex Strength build, not realizing that these stats had little to no effect on the damage, and I would end up respecking later in the run. With the Divine Beast defeated, we head towards Castle Ensis to fight Rellana, the next Remembrance boss on our list. Going through the castle was relatively uneventful, so straight into Rellana we go. In my first playthrough of the DLC, I fought this boss for over 6 hours, so I was honestly worried the run could end here, but once again I was shocked at how well it went. This boss's moveset is ingrained into my brain, so I was feeling pretty good after this first attempt. My equipment and strategy were the same as for the Divine Beast, basically every damage negation talisman from the base game and the fire damage tier. I started the fight by poisoning her and trying to keep distance. After that, I used fire arrows where I could to get damage in, but I was mainly letting poison do all of the work. I got her even lower this time, but got hit by her Glint Blade attack that staggers you and died shortly after. Losing while she was that low definitely hurt, but it totally won't happen a bunch of times throughout the run. On the third attempt, she finally did the back shots of Doom attack, which gives a massive damage window for a ranged build. It definitely got sloppy towards the end, but Rellana falls in 3 tries. This run is proving to be far easier than I expected, and surely there won't be a massive spike in difficulty soon. With Rellana down, that marks our second Remembrance boss, and we can now enter Scadu Altus. After traveling down the highway, Miquella's charm breaks, and we enter the Shadow Keep. After entering, we are immediately faced with our next boss, the Golden Hippopotamus. This entire fight basically boils down to dodge the grab attack. Our strat remains the same, and I was shocked at how easy this fight was with a bow. There were some scary moments, but the Hippo goes down on attempt number 1. Now that we've reached Scadu Altus, we have access to our next weapon, Aigon's Greatbow. Aigon is probably my favorite NPC, so it felt bad to kill him, and him being crippled to the ground didn't help. But with Aigon dead, we have our reward. My main plan for this weapon was to use it against Bayle, since Aigon's arrows do extra damage to dragons. So for now, we're gonna keep using the bone bow. Now that Miquella's charm was broken, the door to the stone coffin fissure is opened, allowing us to fight our next remembrance boss. To get there, I headed to the Cerulean coast and made my way to the giant hole in the map. After a short run to the boss, we've arrived at the Putrescent Knight. We take the plunge to the arena. Now, this boss was infuriating to fight with a bow. All he does is run around and dodge arrows, so I had very few windows to get any actual damage in. On our first attempt, I got caught in his spin attack and died, but before attempting again, I had to go get more thin beast bones to craft arrows. The bell-bearing hunter boss in Limgrave drops a bell-bearing with infinite beast bones, so I made my way over to him and decided to try this fight with Aigon's Greatbow. I was vastly overleveled for this fight, and he went down with relative ease. I also realized that I could craft rot arrows, so I decided to swap those out for poison ones as they were just more effective. Back at the Putrescent Knight, the rot took a while to proc, but it did significantly more damage and took him down to around a fourth of his health.
The planet is dying. The government hates us. The animals are leaving. The aliens aren't contacting us. We might be alone. It just might be you and me, but that's okay because you really need anyone else.
I almost choked at the end because of the spin attack, but I managed to finish him off, using all of my flasks and almost all of my arrows. Oddly enough, this was the first real challenge of the run. With our third remembrance down, I head back to the Shadow Keep to take on all 18 inches of Messmer. There was nothing in this level we needed for our build, so I sprinted through, only stopping to reenact a scene from The Boys.
I'm not suggesting anymore. Jump.
And we eventually made our way to Messmer.
Mongrel intruder, that gutless, it seemeth. Mother, wouldst thou truly smurf cat sanction in one so bereft of riz? Yet my grindset standeth red-pilled. Those phantom taxed of the light-skinned stare shall all meet Ohio in the embrace of Messmer's riz.
Messmer is weak to frost and bleed, so my initial idea was to poison him and then use frost arrows. I didn't get a single frost proc during that first fight, so I decided to swap to lightning arrows as they offered the highest per arrow physical damage available to me. But they didn't make a huge difference, and I died a lot. I fought Messmer for over 11 hours and used well over 4,000 arrows. I got tired of farming for them, so I summoned Dr. Disrespect to drop me some arrows. Luckily, there were no miners around, so he left pretty fast. From here on out, I used rot arrows and frost arrows. At the start of phase 1, I used rot arrows to get an early proc, which took around 30 arrows. After that, I switched to frost, only getting one proc right at the end of phase 1. Phase 2 is where I really struggled to find damage windows, so I ended up not using rot arrows as the buildup was far too slow, getting one hit every 10 seconds. At the end of the fight, I got grabbed while he was 1 HP, and if I would have died here, I probably would have put a hole through my monitor. But 284 attempts, 11 hours, and almost 5,000 arrows later, Messmer falls. I don't think a boss kill in any game I've played has felt as good as this one did. Before continuing in the Shadow Keep, I made my way to the Cathedral of Manus Metyr to activate the Grace for later, and then made my way to the underside of Shadow Keep. A lot of running, platforming, and one unreasonably long elevator later, I found myself at the worst boss in the DLC, Commander Gaius. This fight is awful even with a melee build, so I knew I was probably in for the worst with a bow. My strategy was both rot and poison arrows, and after I procced both, I just tried to stay alive. I also used the Windy Crystal tier to help me dodge the absolute bull that is his charge attack. After getting him aggravatingly low, I was able to beat him after about an hour of attempts. And if I'm being honest, I'd rather do Messmer all over again than fight this boss one more time. After defeating Gaius, I went to the statue on the side of the entrance to his arena and used the Oh Mother gesture to unlock the way to the Shaman village, where one of the best talismans for the last boss is. Once I had grabbed the talisman, I headed back to the Shadow Keep to drain the water. Another long elevator later, and I had reached the Scadutree base. Our next boss is the Scadutree Avatar. This boss isn't exactly hard, but I was worried about 3 phases being too much for my 198 arrows. I died to this boss a lot more times than I should have. A 3-phase fight while doing low damage leaves a lot of time to make stupid mistakes, and no matter how hard I tried, I just couldn't get Rot to proc. Around this time, I started using the Crimson Seed Talisman +1 to offset the insane amount of damage bosses were doing with New Game Plus scaling, and honestly, this talisman is so underrated. At 60 Vigor, I went from having to use 2 flasks to heal the full to only needing 1, and more flasks allowed me to make more mistakes, which is invaluable in a low damage run. Since I couldn't proc Rot, I opted for using 2 stacks of fire arrows, as the Avatar is super weak to fire damage. The Rancor Shot skill on the bow did a really good job of getting the arrows to the boss's head where it's the weakest. After 30 attempts, the Avatar falls. My next idea for the build was to grab the Arrows Soaring Sting Talisman, which boosts the damage and range of arrows, so I headed over to the Fog Rift Fort to grab it. On the way, I encountered this freaky knight who kept trying to lick me, but I found a rock that I could shoot him from for an easy kill, making exploring the rest of the fort a piece of cake. After exploring for a little bit, we had our reward. I decided now would probably be a good time to finish up the Manus Metyr questline and unlock our next Remembrance boss. First, I made my way to the Finger Ruins near the Cerulean coast, and after sucking the finger, I headed back to the cathedral to talk to Ymir and exhaust his dialogue. From there, he sends me to the other set of Finger Ruins near the Shaman village, once again sucking on a finger and heading back to the cathedral. After this, Ymir will leave his chair and you can access the boss arena. Before fighting the boss, however, we have to defeat an NPC invader. I managed to proc Scarlet Rot on her. I don't know how that happened since she's a phantom, but after that she went down pretty quickly. One not so discreet innuendo later and we're transported to Metyr, the Mother of Fingers and our next Remembrance boss. My strategy going into this was, you guessed it, Rot arrows and Frost arrows. Bows are incredibly good at applying status effects from range, and this boss poses almost no threat when you're far away from her. So after a lot of shooting and running, Metyr falls on the first try. Now that we've gotten the easier bosses out of the way, it's time to take on Romina and burn the Scadutree. Upon entering the ancient ruins of Rao, making sure not to get one-shotted by the Timu fire giant guarding the bridge, and I got lost in this underground section like 3 times, but we finally arrive at Romina, Saint of the Bud. For some reason, I didn't think the super poison centipede would be resistant to poison, so the first attempt was doomed from the start. After having this profound revelation that the Rot boss was resistant to rot and poison, I instead opted for bleed and frost arrows. But I was out of the necessary crafting materials, so Dr. Disrespect paid me another visit. However, he unknowingly led the feds right to his location. Now that we have our arrows, we can resume fighting Romina. I also crafted some of the new Golden Vow consumables. They're slightly less effective than the incantation version, but I thought it might be a nice buff to damage negation, and I really just wanted an excuse to use more DLC items. This next attempt went insanely well. I got a few frost and bleed procs and spent most of the fight trying to keep my distance since I don't have her attack patterns down too well, and that clearly shows here as I forgot the heal button existed and let her kill me when she was 1 HP. The next attempt I made sure not to get hit by the Ratusi Stinger move. A few frost and a few bleed procs later, Romina falls on the 3rd try. To progress to the final area of the DLC, we need to burn the Scadutree, but we still had 2 more bosses to take care of before we could head there. First being Bayle the Dread. My plan was to use Igon's great bow that we got earlier, as the arrows you get from it do extra damage to dragons. I started the fight with Rot arrows to try to get an early proc, but I once again forgot that the heal button existed and decided to face tank a punch from a dragon. The next attempt, I managed to proc Rot really early on and swapped to the Great Bow, and was honestly surprised at how much damage it did. I kept using the Great Bow until the Rot ran out, and then swapped back to the Rot arrows, but before I could apply again, the fight was over. Bayle going down in 2 tries was not what I expected, but that goes to show that bows might be much stronger than you think. Our last roadblock before heading to the final area is Midra, the Lord of Frenzied Flame. We're headed to the Dark Light Catacombs, which grants access to the Abyssal Woods after defeating the dungeon boss. After getting lost in the catacombs a few times, we find ourselves faced with Jory, the Elder Inquisitor. In my first playthrough of the DLC, I accidentally fought this boss on Scadutree level 4, and this fight ended up taking me around 3 hours, so I was praying a bow would make this easier. On the first attempt, I managed to proc Scarlet Rot, but instead of playing range, I stayed too close and ended up getting sat on by Gorlock the Destroyer. Attempt 2 went far better. I rotted the boss early in the fight and then ran from the magic and summons, getting hits in where I could. Near the end of the fight, the rot ran out, but the boss was so low that it didn't matter. Jory goes down in 2 tries, and we now have access to the scariest place in the Land of Shadow, Portland, Oregon. I want to spend as little time here as possible, so I immediately head towards Midra's Manse. There are enemies that can't be killed without parrying along the way, and if they see you, it's basically guaranteed death, so my only option was to crouch in this tall grass and sneak around them. After getting past them, we're home free, and we reach the mansion without incident. Upon arrival, the owner of this nice place tells us to come no closer, and honestly, I should have listened. Midra was a boss I expected to be a non-issue, and I could not have been more wrong. After watching the coolest cutscene in the DLC, I proceeded to die. A lot. My strategy remained the same as most other bosses. I'd use bleed arrows in his first phase, if you could call it that. I then switched to rot, and it managed to proc after around 40 arrows. Once Midra was rotted, I tried to keep my distance since a lot of his frenzied flame attacks can be avoided simply by being far away. Midra does have quite a few distance closing attacks, however, and I never got too good at dodging them. Once rot ran out, I knew I didn't have enough arrows to proc it again, so I continued using bleed. After around 5 hours of attempts, Midra falls. This fight was pretty difficult, but it's still super fun and has an amazing OST. Now, this is where shit gets serious. It's time to head to the last area of the DLC. We head back to the ruins of Rao, spin back for Rellana and burn the Scadutree, and are taken to Anir Lim. After a short walk, we're met with our next boss, a triple NPC gank fight. If I'm being honest, I thought the run was over here. After the first attempt, I spent hours trying to figure out different ways to beat this boss. I simply could not do enough damage before I ran out of arrows. And that's not even taking into consideration the fact that they dodge almost every arrow I shoot. So, in the spirit of continuing the run, I summoned one NPC to help with the fight. This was still going to be incredibly RNG based, and it took around 4 hours, but eventually, the NPC somehow managed to solo Dryleaf Dane while I took care of Hornsent, and after that, all that's left is Leda. Leda has quite a few moves you can punish, mainly her long combos if you can create distance and her lightning attack, and with only 4 arrows to spare, Lady Leda and her allies fall to the bow. This is it. The final boss, Miyazaki's magnum opus of difficulty. I, however, have his first phase down to a science from my first playthrough. On try 1, we progressed to second phase, but the moment phase 2 started, I got hit by one of Radahn's after image combos. And this was one of those deaths where you just want to get off because you know how long it's going to take to get this down. I have over 15 hours of footage of me fighting this boss, and I lost count after 300 deaths. Radahn had me tweaking so badly that I decided to respec to 99 vigor and 93 endurance, get Radahn's great rune for more HP, start Patches' questline so he would go to Volcano Manor, do the Volcano Manor invasions until Patches gave me his letter, head to the ruin-strewn precipice and kill Metyr, and finally invade Tragoth so that I could get the tankiest armor set in the game, the Bull Goat set. With our new armor, every damage negation talisman I could find, 2400 HP, and such little sleep that my eyes were turning red, I felt like I finally had a chance. But I just kept dying, and dying, and dying, and dying over and over again with seemingly no progress being made. When this was only the 4-hour mark, I still had 11 more hours before I would beat him. With a build like this, I knew there wasn't going to be any OP item or weapon that would magically help me win. I just had to slam my head into this wall until I learned the moveset. And eventually, it happened. I felt like Maharaga fighting Sukuna seeing through all of his attacks.
You can see it, Maharaga! You can see my curse technique!
I had some extremely close calls, so close that I was physically shaking with anger. But my final strategy became this. Dodge the initial gravity attack and create distance, allowing for some free hits with rot arrows. I would continue to dodge and run backwards on attacks that allowed it, creating more distance to get free hits, but watching for his distance closing attacks. Once rot procced, I then switched to poison. His gravity suck attack was my biggest window for damage, but also my biggest threat if I got too greedy and didn't dodge it. If I positioned myself right and didn't greed, he would usually do this move multiple times, allowing for a bunch of free hits. Once I saw that poison had also procced, I focused less on attacking and more on taking as minimal damage possible before the second phase, seeing as a couple hundred extra damage wouldn't really make a huge difference. Once phase 2 started, I used his Miquella's Light attack that he usually does at the start to get in a bunch of free hits. Since his rot resistance is through the roof in phase 2, I would opt to tank this attack for free hits every time. From that point on, I would dodge his attacks as if I was using a melee weapon, up close and personal, only creating distance when I was positive I could. At around half HP, Scarlet Rot finally procced again, and I would need some really good RNG here to get poison applied. And finally, it happened. He did Miquella's Light again, and I was able to get in a bunch of poison arrows. It hadn't applied yet, but I knew it was close, and after a few more hits, I had him rot and poisoned. This was good, but it wouldn't finish the fight. I knew from previous attempts that this would still leave him with a bit of HP. So this is where the sketchy part comes in. I focus mainly on dodging while waiting for him to get to the HP point where he does the Metyr attack. Once he did it, I quickly opened my menu and swapped to Frost arrows while running across the arena to dodge the Metyr attack, which would one-shot me at full health if I got hit. After the Metyr, I started the barrage of Frost arrows, knowing that I would need a Frost proc to win. And then, the RNG gods blessed me, a third Miquella's Light. I hadn't seen 3 of these in a single one of my 300 plus attempts. I knew that all I had to do was not choke here. I got so nervous when I didn't see a Frost proc after all of those hits, but I knew it had to be close. So close that I was willing to risk possibly dying for it. And right as his attack was about to land, victory. Radahn falls to the bow. As the final cutscene of the DLC played, I genuinely screamed. I don't think anything will come close to the sense of accomplishment I felt when I beat this boss. And with that, the run was over. So can you beat Shadow of the Erdtree, FromSoft's hardest content to date, with nothing but a bow? The answer is yes.
Within the inner heart I plead for you to talk to me. I wanna hear all the good and bad, the new stories you had. As I drift across the sky, the hour hand turns high. So good night, let me sing